Financing the end of global poverty and disease. It seems to me this topic, it poses three questions. The first question is, does aid work? You know, official development assistance, ODA, foreign aid, does it work? And if it does work, then how much money do we have to throw at the problem to do this, to overcome, you know, poverty and disease? And then the third question is, if, assuming those two we can do, how do we raise the money to do that? And obviously we're not ending global poverty, it'll always be with us, as Jesus said. We're not ending disease either. That's the sort of the flat note, but from here it's sort of fairly uphill. But, so on the first question, how does aid work? I thought I'd tell you three stories of three separate aid projects, because as I talk to people about official development assistance, there seems to be an enormous amount of misunderstanding in the community, at least in Australia, about what your money gets spent on. So the things I want to tell you about, one was an aid project that AusAid funded to build sovereign bond markets in Indonesia, which I worked on. The second one was another AusAid funded project to build an agricultural commodities exchange in Vietnam that I also worked on. And the third one is a World Vision project in Niger in Africa with farmers managing the natural regrowth of tree stumps, which the relevant officer from World Vision presented on in this school about a year ago, and has just come out in a book that I've published. Okay, they're the three questions. And they're the three aid projects. So the first one, the reason I want to talk about this is I think when people think of aid, they mainly think of money going overseas to help people who are hungry in a very direct way, you know, corn and wheat and rice and things like that, either going overseas or cash going overseas to buy things. That is part of it, but this is much more typical of the sorts of aid projects that really work. The Asian crisis, you'll remember in the late 1990s, it was the great paradox behind the Asian crisis is East Asia has the highest savings rates in the world. So why did the exodus of foreign capital abroad cause a crisis in a region that saves so much money it doesn't need foreign capital at all? If it could keep the capital at home, it wouldn't need to be borrowing from banks, British and European and American banks, and therefore when troubles come, the capital couldn't run away. So one of the clear lessons, policy lessons, was that East Asian countries needed to develop their own sovereign bond markets. AusAid got onto this. They set up a 3-year project in Jakarta. Critically to the success of it, I think they had one person on the ground for 3 years who, you know, provided both a lot of expertise and a lot of continuity. And then the project was basically to teach the Indonesian government how to do something that had never been done in Indonesia before, which was for the Indonesian government to issue bonds so that Indonesian people, which are you know, promissory notes, so for the Indonesian people could buy these things and put their money in Indonesia rather than their money in North America somewhere. And that worked very, very well. That project worked really well. And I admit I don't think anybody's ever calculated an actual return from it, but the return would be extremely large because what it's done is given a degree of financial stability to Indonesia that it wouldn't have had otherwise. Now Indonesia's got sovereign bond markets, they're working well, and it was no small thing because even though Indonesia had a lot of bright people in the government, it had a lot of people with PhDs in finance, none of them had ever seen a bond. None of them had ever worked in a bond market, none of them understood the legal documentation you needed. So the project was really, even though was brought in, the idea was I was going to draft the legislation, and we did that. What I really did was just exactly what I do here, just a whole lot of teaching, a whole lot of education to 30 people in the Ministry of Finance rather than to a bunch of students. So that's sort of example number one. Example number two, or I've done it in this order in the PowerPoints, is this idea in Niger, this World Vision idea, and it's just one of my favourite stories. That was a typical farm in Niger before this Australian, whose name's Tony Renato, who somebody really should make an Australian story about, had his brainwave. And his brainwave was that he'd been working in Niger as a World Vision officer. He'd been working there for 8 years. He'd gone over there with his wife and 2 kids, and his background is in agriculture, and he was trying to transform that landscape into something that looks like that. He was trying to get away from this, you know, blasted, dry, arid thing, and the way he was doing it was the way he'd been taught to do it in universities, which is you get trees in the nursery and you grow them up and you put the trees in the landscape and you water them and they grow, right? And it wasn't working. It wasn't working because the trees were exotic trees. They weren't trees from this part of Africa. And quite a lot of skill is needed and quite a lot of effort is needed to keep them watered. And there was a big loss between the planting and getting these things established. And after 8 years, it suddenly hit him one day that all the time, little tree stumps would sprout. These fields had never been cleared the way Australian fields are cleared. Right? When settlers came to Australia, we cleared them and really pulled all the roots out and the stumps out, and then so you can run big combine harvesters through these big areas. They've never done that. So his brilliant idea was to suddenly see that the stumps of the native trees were a resource. And they shouldn't, the local people thought they were sort of an embarrassment. What you needed was big, clear, straight farms, because that's what they'd seen in photos of the West. So every time the stumps would start to grow, they'd chop them down. So Tony's idea was to teach them how to nurture those stumps. And it's a couple of old English terms, coppicing and pollarding, which is basically about chopping off some of them and leaving some of the growth. So you never get a tree, you'll never get a one single trunk tree again, but you'll get a tree with maybe 6 smaller trunks, and nurturing that, harvesting that for timber and other things. And what he found over the next best part of 20 years is that it changed the landscape. It changed the landscape by stopping soil erosion. It actually produced, if you get enough greenery, you start to get more rainfall. And also when crops failed, they had an ongoing supply of timber for fuel, and they also had wood for handicrafts and things they could sell and all the rest of it. So after 20 years, that goes into that. And the difference today, he's done studies on it, this area of Niger where he worked in, the difference is $200 per person a year in income. Or another way of looking at it, and 500,000 tonnes of grain. But given the global, this is a sort of a severely poor area, the global benchmark for severe poverty is $1.25 a day, which is, about $400 a year. Increasing income by $200 a year is a dramatic achievement. Tiny by our standards, but significant by theirs. So, and again, if you want to look at it a different way, this is an aerial photo of exactly the same part of Niger 20 years later. And the little black dots are trees. Right? So over here you've got very, very few trees. Over here you've got quite a lot of trees. And a whole lot more productive climate. And a great aid project because A, very cheap to do, and B, very replicable. Once you've got it up and running, you can just bring farmers from other areas to the area where it's working and say, look at this, look how this is different to where you are doing what you've done. And Tony even he has a satellite photo of the whole of, this is all the area that's just south of the Sahara Desert. So one of the problems is desert marching down onto it. And he's got a satellite photo of the whole of that area right across Africa. And you can see where World Vision has worked and you can see where World Vision hasn't worked. It's quite clear over big swathes of immediately sub-Saharan Africa. So that's another great aid project. The third one was one I did about 5 or 6 years ago, which was an agricultural commodities exchange for Vietnam. Now, an exchange is an institution that allows you to enter forward sales contracts on things. So Vietnam is among the top 3 producers in the world of rice, coffee, cashew nuts, pepper, and it's a significant agricultural producer. And Australia had up there a project to modernise Vietnam's commercial law, and Vietnam said, well, one of the modern things we want is a commodities exchange. These things are traded in Australia. There's greasy wool futures and meat futures and everything traded in Sydney. They're traded in Chicago. We want to be able to trade futures contracts on our agricultural produce. We don't want our contracts traded in Chicago. We want them traded into Hanoi. So they appointed an Australian law firm. The Australian law firm asked me to help. And so we got working on this to trade, basically 3 and 6 month forward contracts on commodities. And the idea when it works is a good one. right? The farmer gets a contract, he knows what he's going to get paid in 6 months' time, takes the price risk out of it, takes the great volatility in commodity prices out of it. At the time the farmer's planting their crops, they've got a contract which guarantees what their price is going to be. So it's a very nice idea. A great idea. At the wrong time. If you're going to buy crops 6 months, if you're going to sign a contract to buy crops at the time they're planted, what have you got to be pretty confident about? The amount, there's something even more important than the amount that you're going to get, because you can, you can specify that. You're not typically signing a contract to buy the whole output of a farm. You're signing a contract for a certain amount. You can build in buffers. But what have you got to be really sure about the stuff you're buying? Quality. And in Australia, when they set up the Greasy Wool Futures Exchange a long time ago, they put a huge amount of effort into training wool assessors and, and teaching merino breeders and people and have a whole system of certification so that when you signed a contract for grade AAA wool, what you got was AAA. Now, Vietnam's problem is that it's really good at growing agricultural produce, really good, but its transport infrastructure is not very good. So in getting the produce from where it's grown to where it's shipped, it often gets damp. And dampness is a disaster. So as we I did lots and lots of research on the law, and we eventually drafted some legislation, but it was all misconceived. When I got up there and I started to talk to Vietnamese agricultural experts, the problem was that often when they would ship rice to America, the Americans would refuse the rice. They would say it's all too wet, it's started to ferment, it's a disaster, and the shipment would get dumped. So there was just no way there was an assurance of quality such that a commodities exchange could survive. But it's okay, Hanoi's wonderful, and I got to fly there 3 times, and it was very nice. And, so thanks to Australia's taxpayers. And when I finally, on my 3rd trip, I finally discovered why Vietnam wanted a commodities exchange. It was because Thailand had one. And Thailand had one, and it had just opened just before the Australian modernisation of commercial law project got up there and got started. So Vietnam thought, if Thailand has one, we need to have one. But, so that one, now they've got this legislation, which might be useful one day. All the training we did won't be, because it'll be too long before they can actually get an exchange working. So that's a sort of little snapshot into the world of aid programs. There is quite a bit wrong with aid, especially some countries, not Australia very much, I would say, at all, but larger countries, the States, Japan, Germany, aid projects are often tailored to what the donor country needs rather than the recipient country. But there is also a huge stack of academic research that suggests aid really does work. And I think we need to draw the distinction here between aid and development. Development is a very difficult project. If you think about it, not many countries have developed since World War II, in the last 65 years. I can think of about 8 in 65 years out of 200.
That have developed based on aid or developed generally?
Just developed generally.
Could you name those 8?
Oh, well, Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, Mexico, the Yangtze Delta in China, if you treated it as a separate area around Shanghai, if you treated it as a separate country, Turkey, that's probably about it. That were developing countries at the end of World War II and are developed countries now. But I don't think, I think that's an awful success rate, right? 7 out of 200 in 65 years. But I don't think that means aid doesn't work. I think what it means is development is really a very difficult project. It requires good governance in the recipient countries. It requires a much more level playing field in international trade than the rich world gives the developing world. And it requires something very different from the Washington Consensus policies, which is what the developed world has pushed on the developing world for the last 40 years. So they're sort of different, they're different issues, I think. One issue is how good are we at helping poor countries to become richer, and overall we're not all that good. and we go about it in the wrong way. There's a separate question though, how successful are individual aid projects? And you know, I think when they're well structured, they're fairly successful. So the question then becomes, so I think we can do it. And most people think we can do it. We can't get rid of disease, but we can make a very big dent on AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis, which are the three that everybody focus on. And we can make a very big dent on poverty and hunger. So how much money do we need to raise to do it? Well, aid in 2009 was 120 billion. And the global goal for aid is this figure, which is an odd sort of figure, 0.7%. But that's a figure that was, it's been said to me more than once that the person who developed that figure was an Australian, Anthony Ross, who is these days an emeritus professor of economics somewhere in Scotland. I suspect there was a woman involved. There usually is when a bright Australian ends up on the other side of the world permanently. But anyway, in the 1960s he had, that's a fair comment, isn't it?
Well, it was the other way, coming to Australia, that makes some sense. Scotland's bloody cold, why would we leave Australia?
That's why there's got to be a woman involved. Anyway. Justin would attest to that. There's always something like that. Moving on. 0.7% of gross national income is a goal that nearly every country in the world has committed to in terms of aid budgets. And it would represent a further 153 billion. So we're basically at 120 billion and we're at about 0.31%. There's 5 countries that are at 0.7% or over: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Holland and Luxembourg are the 5 that are there. Australia is at about 0.35 at the moment. The overall level is so low because the Americans are so mean. The Americans have by far the lowest, as a proportion of national income, aid budget in the world. Put it in our context, this year we'll spend $4.5 billion on aid, which is $3.30 from each of you each week. So each of you, whether you like it or not, spends the price of a small cup of coffee on aid every year. And if we were giving what we've committed to give, what we've actually signed some international instrument about that says we're going to give, Andrew Burns will be able to tell you whether that instrument's worth anything, but we've signed it, we'd be giving double. Right? We'd be giving nearly 9 billion if we were giving what we were giving. So that figure, 150 billion, is pretty significant as we go through. So there's a question, how do we rate, so that's how much we need. Well, let me slow down a little bit. The 150 billion figure is, oh okay, didn't produce it. So how much do we need? Anthony Ross, who came up with the idea of 0.7%, wrote a chapter for me in the same book that Tony Renato wrote a chapter for me in, and he was just looking at the idea of, if we wanted to completely eliminate global poverty, how much money would we just have to give to the poor countries each year? And he wasn't suggesting that's a clever way to do it, because it's not a clever way to do it. Right? The clever way to do it is what Tony's doing in Africa, you know, improving the environment, improving the agriculture, or what, you know, we managed to help Indonesia do, improving its financial system. But if you just look at it as a straight wealth transfer, how much is needed? And what Anthony's figures suggest is that all that's needed is something like 90 billion a year. And the amount that's needed for halving malaria, TB and AIDS is about 25 to 35 billion a year. So if you put those two figures together, you're still quite a long way south of the 150 billion a year. So if we just increased aid and just transferred the money straight across and then had a separate pool of money for fighting disease, we would be there on the current promises, on the 0.7% promise, if all the rich countries were doing what they promise. So that's one way to look at it. The United Nations has looked at it in a different way, and the UN figures are, to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, are another 90 billion a year. And the Millennium Development Goals are a different set of goals. They're not trying, Ross's figures are just to get rid of poverty. The Millennium Development Goals are to halve extreme poverty and then to do a whole lot of other things, achieve universal primary education, reduce maternal death in childbirth by 2/3, reduce infant mortality by 1/2, and a number of other things. So they're a much broader range of goals, but in a lot of areas they only try and solve half or 2/3 of the problem, not all of the problem. But the UN's figures to achieve that is an estimate of 90 billion. The World Bank's figures to achieve that are quite a bit less than that, maybe 60 billion. So again, we're well within that 150 billion. If we were giving what we promised to give in the West, then we would have enough money to either achieve the Millennium Development Goals or, completely eliminate poverty. So then the question becomes, how do we get the money? If aid works, and if, the money is not an amount that's out of our reach, five countries are already giving this much, how do we raise it? Some of you may know Kathleen in the law school, and when she saw this speech, she's the nice lady who sits at the reception desk on level 2. When she saw I was giving this speech, she collared me in the photocopy room and said, arms budgets. You can just take it out of arms budgets. It's simple. It's easy. And she's right, of course. She's more right than she knows, I suspect. Because the sad truth is global arms budgets last year were 1.5 trillion. So the 150 billion we need is just 10% of that. And we could just snip 10% of that off that, and we would have, largely defeated malaria, TB, AIDS, and made a massive dent into extreme poverty. So if that doesn't make you sad, nothing should make you sad. But of course, that's not easy to do. So what are other ways to do it? France tried a few years ago to get a financial tax. When it couldn't get a financial tax, it came up with a tax on airline tickets. There's a different way of raising money. So this was 2006. I think 13 nations have joined in now. And the tickets are the tax is anywhere between €1 and €40. €1 on short flights in Europe, €40 on long-haul international flights. And a range of countries are on this bandwagon, from rich countries like France to poor countries like Niger in Africa. But it's raised $2 billion since 2006. And late last year, there's a different scheme to have a voluntary $2 levy. When you book your airline ticket, you get asked, are you willing to devote $2 to fight AIDS, malaria and TB? So that's sort of just starting. But these are not on the scale of what we need. I mean, they're a lot better than nothing. And this $2 billion has all gone to a UN agency that buys drugs for AIDS, malaria and TB. So it's very targeted on those diseases, but it's not what we need. The easy way to do it, that's Keynes for those of you who don't know him, is a tiny tax on all wholesale capital market transactions. So on all derivatives and all foreign currency transactions, but not retail banking transactions. If you want to make it more simple, you can just put it on foreign currency transactions, and if you do that, it's a Tobin tax. It was the brainchild of James Tobin, who was a Yale economist who had the idea in about 1972, and he had the idea just as neoliberalism was on the ascendant, right? Just as this idea that markets are all powerful was really rising. So as Tobin himself said, he'd never in his whole life had an idea that sunk more quickly and permanently, and he gave a couple of speeches about it. Nobody said anything about it for a long time. But, what's interesting is Tobin was not a bleeding heart left-wing type. He was a conventional economist who went on to win a Nobel for different work in economics, and he didn't propose a tax on foreign currency transactions to raise money. He proposed it to improve the workings of a market that he already saw had too much speculation in it, and that he already saw was being driven to quite large inefficiencies because of the amount of speculation. Since Tobin had that idea, the world's changed hugely. In 2009, computer-driven trading accounted for over 60% of US equity trading. And what this means, a lot of these trades, of those 60%, about 2/3 of them can be measured in fractions of a second. So shares or other financial instruments in the US are bought, held and sold, and the total transaction takes less than 1 second. Goldman Sachs has worked out that every millisecond it saves on its trading is worth $100 million a year to it. So it has therefore moved its computers into the same building as NASDAQ, which is America's big computerised share market, at one of the 3 biggest share exchanges in America. Goldman's now has its computers in the same building because the time it took the electrons to travel over the copper wires from 5 kilometres away, it worked out was costing it money. Hedge fund traders in France have all moved their computers to London because the time to get across the channel was too expensive. Right? And this is the modern trading environment. This obviously didn't exist 30 years ago. Right? It's something that started in the probably early 80s. What you see in that is that today financial transactions are 75 times GDP. They were 15 times 20 years ago. In Australia, they're 98 times. Before we had the GFC in 2007, Australia's financial market transactions were 98 times bigger than our GDP. Now, GDP is relevant because that is the sum of all the economic transactions in the economy. Every time you buy a cup of coffee, you're adding to GDP. So in Australia, before the GFC, there was basically 100 times as much stuff happening in our financial markets as in our real economy. These are recent changes and they're sort of profound changes. So if Tobin was right about currency transactions 30 or 40 years ago, I think he'd be a lot more right if he was alive today. Sadly, he passed away about 5 years ago, I think. So a number of people around the world have had an idea of a financial transactions tax. A very, very small tax on all these capital market transactions, partly to raise money, but more, I think, because there's really quite a lot of evidence. There's an Austrian economist called Schulmeister, there's a Canadian economist called Rodney Schmidt, and there's a number of others who are producing quite a lot of evidence that this modern sort of computer-driven thing doesn't actually help markets work better, it helps them work worse. Right? Markets are really critical. If you get pricing signals wrong from markets, you get a lot of problems in your economy. And nothing as, even though Colin Picker, a new hire here, keeps telling me I'm a communist because he's American and he thinks we're all incredibly socialistic in this country. I really do believe in markets. I've never seen anything else that sends signals to people to tell them how to act as well as pricing signals coming out of markets. But this sort of change in the last 20 years that has more than half of the trading driven by computers, what is not in those computer programs is anything about the value of what's being traded. Right? The computer programs say buy or sell based on what's happened in the minutes and seconds and hours leading up to that point in the price of the share. There's nothing built in there saying, well, this economic fundamentals of this company are such and such.
So you say it's technical trading?
It's all technical trading. That the way these things are written, it's virtually all technical trading. And so what the economists are now suggesting is this preponderance of technical trading is causing long-term variations from what the real values should be, the real prices should be. And so you're getting long-term wrong signals being sent to the market because prices aren't where they should be because the market is not being set by people who are really concerned with what the value of the thing is. It's being set by something quite different. So, who supports this idea of a financial transactions tax? Gordon Brown, before he got thrown out of number 10 Downing Street. This is Joe Stiglitz, for those of you who don't know him, the world's most cited economist. That's Dr. Reddy, who Joe Stiglitz said if this fellow had been in charge of the US Fed rather than Alan Greenspan, America never would have had a subprime crisis. He was the governor of the Central Bank of India for most of the last decade. And 1,000 other economists. About 3 weeks ago, I wrote an opinion piece for a website, which about 2 weeks ago, which began, something remarkable has just happened, 1,000 economists have agreed on something. And they did. At the last meeting of the G20, finance ministers in Washington, DC, I think, 1,000 economists signed a letter saying that they thought this idea was a really, really good idea. So the question would be, how much would it raise? We put this very small tax on transactions, how much would it raise? Well, the first thing is, given the preponderance of technical trading, you're going to knock a lot of that out. Even at 0.005%, you're going to knock out quite a lot. At 5 basis points, 0.05%, my estimate is you'll probably dissuade 2/3 of the transactions. And you really see big philosophical, when I've talked to Treasury about this, you talk to Treasury in Canberra, very bright people, and they say, well, that's impossible. Markets are critically important. You couldn't have anything that cuts out 2/3 of a market. But we are talking about 1/20th of 1%. So how substantial are those transactions if 1/20th of 1% means they're not worth doing at all? So the revenue figures, I'm sort of conservative, and so I say we'll get rid of 2/3 of them. How much would it raise? Well, those are the rates, 0.05 to 0.5, and that's probably the range. 75 billion at the lower figure. At the higher figure, the estimates range anywhere from sort of 400 billion to 600 billion. So say 500. This gives you an idea also how much the world has changed. In my experience, most people are flabbergasted by these figures because they just have no appreciation for how much money is zipping around the world. 40 years ago in Australia, most money that came in and out of Australia was to pay for goods and services. These days, the money that's used for trade, in other words, trade in tangible things like these computers and these, screens and everything. These days, trade's almost irrelevant to our capital account. More than 100 times as much money moves in and out of Australia for portfolio investment purposes than for trade purposes. In other words, financial markets have just completely dominated the movement of money around the globe. And that's what these figures show you. That if tax as small as that can raise an amount of money as large as that. And the critical figure to put into that context is the 150 billion we had up before, which is the amount by which we're short on the promises on aid, and which is the amount which would be more than enough to deal, to get rid of 2/3 of global poverty and hunger, and having a similar impact on malaria, AIDS, and TB. So civil society around the world has jumped on this. If you're interested, the Brits have called it the Robin Hood tax. I didn't like the idea of Robin Hood tax in Australia, but I lost the argument, so it's called the Robin Hood tax here. Nobody would listen to me. It's just like being in the law school, really, working with these NGOs. Nobody listens to you. And for those of you who know Bill Nighy, the British actor who did The Boat That Rocks and other things, he does an absolutely brilliant thing. So if you want to, on the web, Google Robin Hood tax and look at the little video with Bill Nighy. He plays a banker who's very inconvenienced by the idea of this very, very small tax. But some countries are very supportive of it. It's not just economists. Nicolas Sarkozy has been its biggest supporter. Angela Merkel is quite a big supporter. Barack Obama was a big supporter before he got the nomination for president. He's never mentioned a word of it, certainly since he's been in office. But when he was running against Hillary for the nomination, he was a supporter of the financial transactions tax. And and as I said, Gordon Brown was. David Cameron is not now in the UK. So we did have a period there where we had Merkel in Germany, Sarkozy in France, Brown in the UK, and possibly Obama in America, who all thought it was a good idea. But now Gordon Brown's gone. Canada is very against it. Australia is very against it. So it's there. It's there in the G20 at the moment. It's being debated. It's not an easy thing to do for one country to do. Britain has imposed levies on its own banks, which will raise £2.5 billion a year. It can do that because it knows the banks aren't going to move for that reason. This is not, one country couldn't do this. I don't think every country needs to do it, but at the very least, I don't think a European country can do it without Britain because the trading will move to London too easily. I don't think the trading will leave Europe. If all of Europe did it, it could do it without America. And if all of Europe did it, you've got to remember the majority of the transactions are international, and the Europeans would be taxing them at their end and not sharing the revenue with the Americans at the other end. Whereas if the Americans imposed it, then there'd be a sharing arrangement. So I think if Europe did it, then America would almost have to follow suit. Otherwise it'd be saying no to a big bundle of revenue. Like a lot of things in the modern world, when Tobin proposed it, it was basically not doable. Trading was done on proprietary systems, it wasn't centralised in any way, and the actual mechanics of doing it would have been incredibly difficult in 1972. Today, even the IMF admits it's very easy to do, because modern foreign exchange and other derivatives trading is all settled and cleared over about 3 clearinghouses. So all they have to do is have a law that tells those clearinghouses to collect the little bits of money, the tiny bits of money, when the transactions clear through them, and the implementation is very, very simple. And it costs much more than 0.5% to move back to proprietary systems. So nobody's going to move away from the clearinghouse back to the old-fashioned ways of doing it, because it would be far more expensive, it would be cheaper to pay the tax. So there is a big international debate going on as we speak. The IMF is against the idea, but its intellectual integrity forces it to say that it would be easy to implement, but it's against the idea for another reason, and it's got its own tax, an alternative which doesn't raise nearly as much money, called a financial activities tax, but has a much nicer acronym. So, you know, there is a big debate going on. What's extraordinary is the debate doesn't seem to make it to Australia. That, you know, there's events happening all the time in Europe. Germany and France are strongly behind it. I'm not persuaded personally that Sarkozy is as behind it as he says. I suspect he's playing to a crowd in his electorate. You know, he's playing to a lot of people in France without necessarily being willing to implement it if he got the opportunity. But anyway, that's the sort of international state of play. I continue to badger Treasury about it whenever I get a chance, and they continue to tell me they're not going to do it. But if you were in Europe, that's the lapel button that you'd see quite a lot of people wearing. It's a little square lapel button, and it's policy of the Greens and the Social Democrats in the European Parliament and in, you know, a number of the national electorates. So that is what they're pushing overseas at the moment.